Hi everyone, welcome back to another anatomy video. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at skull landmarks, primarily of an adult skull. I am making another video on a fetal skull, so if you guys have any questions or comments or concerns, then go check out that video that I'm going to post. So please like and subscribe for more content. And now we're going to look at a frontal view of an adult skull. So, the first important thing to notice is that you're gonna have these um, little like nasal bones over here that are at the bridge slash top of your nose. You can kind of see how there is like this fissure or line that is in between the two bones. So, these are your nasal bones. Then within your eyes, you have two fissures. So you have your superior orbital fissure, which is this black crack over here. Whenever you see the word fissure, it often refers to a crack within the bone. So superior orbital fissure. Next up, you have your inferior orbital fissure, which is right down below. You can see that there's like a little bit of a dark patch over here. So that whole portion is your inferior orbital fissure. Next, you have your optic canals. On this view, the optic canals are a little bit harder to see, but they are going to be just like a singular kind of like dot that is located over there. And from there, the nerves and sensories from the outside world are going to be able to be transcribed to your brain so that you can interpret what you are seeing and kind of like the whole vision process. So that is your optic canal. Next, you have your metopic suture. The metopic suture is basically just a little squiggly line that is going to run above the nasal bones. On this skull, it doesn't really have it because this is a fake skull. It is not from a real human, but there would be a metopic suture over here on real humans. All right, next up, you have your mental foramen. Foramen always refers to a hole, so you can see that there's a hole here, and then there's also a hole on the other side. That is your mental foramen, and it is part of your mandible. Next, you have the alveolar processes. This is basically your gum line, so where your teeth are going to be embedded into the bone. Alveolar processes. And then the very last part is your intermaxillary suture. Intermaxillary suture is this line that is visible from kind of like your nose portion to your teeth. You can kind of see that there's like this crack over here. That is referring to the intermaxillary suture. All right, next we are going to take a look at a different view. So this was your frontal view. Now we're going to be looking at your side view. First thing that we're going to notice is just the different regions of your skull. So you have your frontal bone over here. I'll label it with an F. Then the parietal is this portion from here to here. Occipital is the back of the head. I labeled it with an O. And then temporal is in the middle region. Next, you have your Pterion region. The Pterion region is basically kind of just like this portion over here. So it's semi in the temporal region, a little bit in the frontal. Now we're going to move on to the eyes. So you have your lacrimal sulcus, which is this little indent that you can see over here. On the skulls, when you're actually holding them, it can kind of look like a hole sometimes, but it is meant to be a indent. This is also where your tears come from. So it's kind of towards the inner corner of your eye, lacrimal sulcus. Then you have the lacrimal bone, which is just like the bone region right next to it. So that would be the lacrimal bone. All right, next we're going to take a look at this little like cheekbone area over here. So the first thing to notice is that you have your zygomatic bone, which is this over here. I like to think of it as your cheekbone. Zygomatic bone, aka your cheekbone. Then you have the temporal process. Temporal process is basically kind of just like this region over here that I can shade in. That is your temporal process. So it is right next to your zygomatic bone. And then you have your zygomatic process. The zygomatic process is this line over here. So that thin, skinny little piece of bone. Process. Next, you have something that is called your zygomatic arch. I want to increase the size of this, and it's not really working. Zygomatic process. So your zygomatic arch is pretty much kind of just like this whole region, which includes your zygomatic bone, your temporal process, and your zygomatic process. So I'm just going to put a bracket over here. This whole region is known as your zygomatic arch because all of those bones collectively work together to create the arch, is basically how that works. Next, you have your external auditory canal. That is this hole right over here, and it connects to your ear, so then it allows sound waves to come in to the brain and be processed. External auditory canal. All right. Next up, we have the styloid process. The styloid process is going to be this little like kind of fang looking thing that is going to be right next to your mastoid process. So styloid process looks like a fang. And then right next to it, this like thicker projection over here, that is your mastoid process. All right, now we're going to look at a couple things that are on your mandible. So the mandible has a condylar process. The condylar process is going to be this little head over here. It looks a little bit more rounded and a little bit more of a ball shape to it. Condylar process. And then next we have your coronoid process. The coronoid process is a little bit more pointy. It's over here, this region. So it looks kind of like a triangle, a little bit more pointy. And again, that is your coronoid process. All right, that is pretty much everything when in retrospect of landmarks. There is a couple sutures though. The first suture that is important to know is your lambdoidal suture. This little squiggly line over here near your occipital bone is the lambdoidal suture. For some reason, to me, I feel like the word sounds very similar to Lamborghini. So I suppose if that helps you remember it, then that is one way. All right. And then we have your squamosal suture, which is going to be over your temporal bone. It's this suture right over here. So that one is your squamosal. Next up, we have the coronal suture. Coronal suture is like your crown of your head. So it's right over here, separating your frontal and your parietal bones. I'm not quite sure how to help you with that. So again, that is your coronal suture. Perfect. Okay, now we are going to move on to looking at the inferior view of the skull. So, first thing, you have your palatine process. Palatine process is going to be this first portion of the bone that is on the roof of your mouth. Palatine process. Next, we have your palatine bones. Palatine bones is right under it over here. That region. Okay. And then we have your vomer or vomer, however you want to pronounce it. It's basically kind of like these holes and this plate that is below there. So that is your vomer. Okay. Then we have the median palatine suture. Median palatine suture is just this line that is running through your palatine process. Right? Then the mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa is where your kind of like mandible is able to sit within your skull. So right over here, that is an example of where your mandibular fossa would be. Okay. Then you have the mastoid process again. It's this little like kind of projection of bone that is popping out. Same as over here. That is also your mastoid process, but now we're just looking at it from an inferior view mastoid process. Then you have your jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is going to be below, so it's going to be this here. And then above it, we're going to have the carotid foramen. So this hole over here. So it goes carotid and then jugular. All right. Perfect. Now we have the foramen magnum, which is the biggest hole within the skull. It's this one over here. And foramen magnum literally means big hole. So knowing the Latin is really, really helpful. You have your occipital condyles next up. Occipital condyles is basically just going to be these little projections that are by the foramen magnum. Occipital condyles. All right. So now we're going to take a look at kind of like this bottom portion over here. So, of course, you have your occipital bone within this region, and then you have your superior nuchal line. If you kind of like see this indent over there at the very bottom, that is your superior nuchal line. All right, perfect. Now we're going to look at the skull if it was cut in a mid-sagittal plane. So the first thing you have to know is your frontal sinus. The frontal sinus is this region over here. Then you have your perpendicular plate or your ethmoid bone, which is this whole portion over there, and you can see the spelling over here. Your vomer is going to sit right underneath it. So if you remember when we were looking at this view, you can see that the vomer is kind of like that portion and this line that's in between. Now you can see more closely the line, and that is your vomer. Finally, you have your cristogali. Cristogali are going to kind of be like these little points that are up here at the top. So that is the cristogali. Then you have the sphenoidal sinus, which is this hole over here. Sphenoidal sinus, you can see the spelling for it right over here. Sella turcica is going to be this indent over here that is right next to the sphenoidal sinus. So that is your sella turcica. You don't need to say the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica. If you say sella turcica, it should be descript enough. All right, and that is everything for kind of like this halfway cut. You can see other things that I have covered in the other kind of like views of the skull, but for this mid-sagittal cut, you're primarily just going to need to know the ones that I pointed out. All right, now we're gonna go to another cut where it's like if you took off the very top of your head. So from here, you can see the cristogali even better. You can see like the pointiness of it. The cribriform plate is basically all of these like little dots that are around the cristogali. So this dotted region right there is considered to be your cribriform plate. Now, you have some different cranial fossas. The first of which is your anterior cranial fossa, which is going to be this whole region over here and over there. Then you have the middle cranial fossa, which is this portion and this portion. And then finally, the posterior cranial fossa is going to be this indent on both right and left. Again, you have your foramen magnum, which is the hole in the center. You have your sella turcica, which is this little indent over here. And then you have your optic canals, which you can see from the top. They're basically going to be like these holes that are over here. If you were to have a skull in front of you, and if you take like a pipe cleaner and put the pipe cleaner through the hole at the top, then you would see that it would come out at the eye area where the optic canal is. Now we're going to look at a closer look of the skull when it is dissembled. So this is a sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is going to sit up here at the top and it's going to be embedded within the skull. So it's kind of making up like the top of the head region and also the eye region. So I will put sphenoid bone right here at the top. Important parts of the sphenoid bone include your optic canals, which once again, they're going to be like the little holes, which are going to be here and here. Then you have your sella turcica, which is this indent region. Oops, let me erase that. Which is the indent region over here. That's your sella turcica. And then the main thing that you have to remember is your greater versus lesser wings. So the greater wings are going to be basically like this top portion over here and here. These are your greater wings. It's easy because they're going to be bigger, while the lesser wings are at the bottom. So they're at the bottom of them, right here and right here. They're also a lot smaller. So these are your lesser wings. Finally, you have your pterygoid processes, which are going to be these little projections over here and there. You have them on both sides, right and left. And again, these are your pterygoid processes. So the sphenoid bone doesn't really have a crazy lot. You just need to know lesser wings, greater wings, your sella turcica, and pterygoid processes. Very last bone that we're going to look at is going to be your nasal bones and kind of like your ethmoid bone. So within the middle, you have your perpendicular plate. This right over here is your perpendicular plate. Some people also call it the ethmoid bone. Then on the sides of the perpendicular plate, you have your nasal conchae. So everything on the side over here and over here, that is your nasal conchae. All right. Finally, you have your cristagalli, which is this little kind of point over here at the top, the projection of bone. cristogali. And then you have your cribriform plate on the sides, which is the bone that has all of these little holes in it over here. That's your cribriform plate. So that is everything for the adult skull. There is a lot, but a lot of it kind of overlaps to other planes of the skull. So, you can see your cristogali and your cribriform plate over here on this smaller bone, and then you can also see it up here at this top view. So, the same terminology, just in multiple places it can be found. So that is everything for this lesson. I hope you guys found it informational. If you have any more questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comment section. Again, like and subscribe for more content. And if you have any questions on the fetal skull, then go ahead and check out my video on that as well. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next time.